Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. Every week here on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. My name is Patrick Cummings. Thank you so much for tuning into the show this week. I'm here with just a quick introduction to a conversation that EC had recently with Ashley Gearhardt. Ashley Gearhardt, she's a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. She developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which we'll link to in the show notes, which exists to operationalize addictive eating behaviors and has been cited over 800 times and translated into over 10 foreign languages. EC and Ashley discuss the concept of addiction beyond just identifying a single substance in food, highlighting the addictive mechanisms at play in the spectrum of addictive behaviors, parallels between big tobacco and the modern food environment, revealing shocking insights into how processed foods have been engineered to be hyper-palatable and addictive. And they also talk about the roles of cues and context in driving compulsive cravings, even when the enjoyment of the food diminishes. We'll get into the episode momentarily, but first, a request. If you like this show, if you like the Consistency Project, any of the episodes that we put out on a weekly basis, one of the best things that you can do to help us continue making the show is to share it. Share it with a friend, a colleague, somebody at the gym, somebody at work. Let them know that this is a place that they can get real, honest, no BS advice and information on nutrition and health more broadly. EC and I thank you in advance for sharing the show. Without further ado, here's Ashley and EC. Enjoy.
One of the things that I'm hoping that you can kind of kick us off with here is helping everybody understand why addiction is beyond just identifying a single substance in a food. I think your review paper, I think it was with Schulte, if I'm saying the last name correctly, did a really excellent job explaining kind of, hey, what really makes something addictive? And so maybe you can kind of delineate some of those other factors besides, let's just saying, finding the nicotine in cigarettes or something like that.
Absolutely. So I feel like this is a question I get a lot. And I think even from people in the addiction world, it's something that we often kind of have to think through. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing magical about the nicotine chemical or the ethanol chemical on its own. It's not like you can look at that chemical signature and say, this is clearly an addictive substance. And usually, these products that exist in nature, nicotine is something that exists in nature. It's in eggplant, it's in tomato, it just naturally occurs. It happens to occur naturally in higher levels in a tobacco leaf. Nobody is consuming eggplant and raw tobacco leaves for their nicotine value because A, it will poison you if you do that with raw nicotine, but also it's just not at a high enough dose. It's not optimized for delivery in the naturally unprocessed products that exist. The majority of addictive substances, the vast majority, are humans taking something that exists in nature, like a leaf, like a grape, like a potato, and refining it and processing it and altering it. So there's some sort of chemical that's good at activating the reward system of the brain. And by processing it, you alter it. And so now you get this high dose, really rapidly delivered into the system. And that becomes more addictive. But even that, it's not just, cigarettes deliver nicotine rapidly at a high dose into the brain. You can give people nicotine inhalers and they don't find them that addictive. It's not just the chemical, but the entire optimized experience of the taste and the flavor and the palatability. So with cigarettes, it's got 4,000 chemicals. A lot of them don't really have much to do with nicotine. They're sugar, they're cocoa, they're menthol, they're about the smell of the smoke and the stability of the cigarette. So they're cheap and can be in your gas station. It's this optimized, ultra-processed product that becomes highly addictive. And so when I look at that, we have a sense that sugar and fat that occur naturally in things like bananas and nuts, they really are effective as well at activating our reward system. If they weren't, we would die because for much of human history, there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough calories. And so for our brains to remember that this high sugar berries or that high fat nuts were really rewarding, and to be motivated to seek them out and to see the cues that tell us they might be available, that was evolutionarily beneficial. And so the fact that sugar and fat are good at activating the reward system of the brain has been great, until we got really good with our food technology of stripping out and refining and processing the sugars and the fat and chemicals that mimic the experience of sweetness and, mouthfeel that you get with fat, and creating these ultra processed products that deliver, again, in a naturally high doses, rapidly fast into our body, these rewarding chemicals of sugars and fats and sweet taste and umami sort of feel in the mouth. And they're amplified so much by flavor enhancers and texturizers and things that help them be shelf stable, so they can sit at your gas station for 4 months and you can pick up a baked apple pie for, $1.50 that's been sitting there in plastic. So I think people often think that addictive substances just boil down to, does it have this chemical, yes or no? And that really does not capture what we know about addiction and the complexity of it. Another example I just like to give is, the FDA is considering removing menthol out of cigarettes. This wouldn't touch the nicotine at all. It would be expected to save millions of lives, because that menthol, the taste, the cooling feeling, all those somatosensory experiences that are coupled with the nicotine make them much more enjoyable and palatable and desired. And people want their menthol hit, not just their nicotine hit. So when I think about that, when I look at our current food supply, there's so many of even some of the same flavor enhancers that were used in tobacco products and preservatives are in our food supply now. And people start to crave, the specific taste of Coca-Cola. It's why they trademark these, and guard vehemently their specific taste formula, right? Because people they prefer their Coke over their Pepsi, even though they're both just high sugar because of that experience. And that's kind of what we saw with tobacco, is that people get very attached to their brand of cigarettes and won't easily switch to other cigarettes or other nicotine delivery devices that don't taste like their brand of cigarettes. So it's just not as black and white. But when we even look at the complexity of how you create addictive substances, there's obvious and clear parallels to the sorts of ultra-processed, unhealthy foods that people struggle with in a way that really resembles an addiction.
Yeah. That stat about the 4,000 chemicals is astounding. And I think it's a really great way for people to understand, because I think one of the things that you see in pushback, at least in social media land, is, well, no one's addicted to granulated sugar. But that's not the whole point. The whole point is it's the combination that's so addictive.
Exactly. Nobody is consuming, again, people will choose to smoke cigarettes that have had the nicotine removed, people who are addicted, to get the experience of the taste of smoking a cigarette. Even if you remove the nicotine, they will choose that over an IV delivery of straight nicotine. Same thing with alcohol. We see, my training was in a simulated bar lab, and if you bring people into a very neutral hospital setting and give them a straight IV drip of ethanol and raise their blood alcohol level, most people are like, I feel kind of shitty. I feel kind of crappy. I'm tired. I'm not getting any of the exciting, stimulating effects that I get when I drink. We'd bring people into this bar lab, this lab that was set up to have the colors and the cues and the wood bar of being at a bar, and we give them, a Cosmopolitan, which is a teeny tiny bit of alcohol, and people would report feeling stimulated and relaxed in that whole experience. So if you think about it, nobody is consuming kind of straight nicotine. Nobody is consuming straight ethanol, right? People aren't drinking straight grain alcohol. There's sweet spots, there's combinations that really are where it's at. And so it's, that's also true. But people do consume straight sugar. If you look at most sodas are just
soda, right? Yeah.
Water, jelly beans. A lot of those candies are just mainline sugared and slightly different packages.
Right. Yeah. And I think I saw you on one podcast discussing some of the dopamine responses of these processed foods, comparing them to addictive. And I've certainly seen that in social media. Do you mind sharing kind of where processed foods fall on that sort of scale?
Absolutely. So, when we first started doing this work, people are like, oh, but like, yes, of course, these foods are activating the reward system of the brain. That's important, but it can't be anywhere near addictive substances. Like, look at cocaine. It specifically gets in there, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and activates dopamine. So like 1,000% over baseline. But actually, our most deadly addictive drugs in our society are smoking, alcohol. They're much more subtle. Nicotine, ethanol, it's more about 150 to 200% above baseline of dopamine and kind of the mesolimbic dopaminergic reward system. Way different than cocaine, but clearly still capable of being addictive. When you look at sugar, when you look at fat, when you look at ultra-processed food combos, it's really around that same bar of 150 to 200% above baseline. And one of the things that I think we need to explore more is my colleague, Alex DeFelice-Antonio, who's at Virginia Tech. She's fantastic. And she has this beautiful chapter that's coming out in our Food and Addiction, a Comprehensive Handbook, the second edition that's coming out in July. And what you see is she maps out in these different studies kind of when the dopamine's released. It's released at the moment you taste the sweetness. The moment you taste the fat, you get dopamine spikes. You also then get secondary dopamine spikes once it hits the gut, and it alters your blood glucose, it alters your lipid profile. So when I think of many of the kind of ultra-processed foods that we're seeing today, you're getting way more palatable sweet fat combo taste in the mouth, you're getting the dopamine release very immediately from that. And then you're getting these additional spurts of dopamine later on when it's hitting the gut. And there's evidence that fat and carbohydrates seem to get from the gut to the brain through different biological pathways. Well, in nature, fat and carbohydrate don't come in high levels together in high combinations. Alex has done work to show combining fat and carbohydrate together has this amplified effect on the reward system. We don't fully know why, but I think it makes sense based on what we see, that because our system is not accustomed to it, you're getting this combo sweet fatty hit of dopamine when it hits the mouth, and then through multiple different pathways in your body that are generally not amplified by the same product, you're getting this amplification of dopamine when it hits the gut as well. So it's very interesting to see how these different products are kind of really activating these systems.
Yeah, so that's interesting. It's so immediate that you get that instant feedback. Okay, keep doing this thing and eating it. Does any dopamine get released just based on the cues? Because you've talked about kind of the environment and stuff. So can you have the dopamine response even from entering the bar, let's say?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So there's definitely work that when you look at just being, and for people who develop more of that compulsive addictive pattern of intake, that seems to be one of the things that really marks that propensity towards addiction. So when people have kind of, there's this misunderstanding a little bit that addiction is all about feeling like blissed out, feeling like just enjoying this so much. I'm in so much pleasure that I can't really stop. There's actually evidence that dopamine actually isn't so much about feeling bliss or pleasure. It's more about drive and desire.
Right.
And what you see is that generally if you consume something and you like it, I read a good book, I listened to some music, I had, some ice cream, I had a drink of alcohol. Initially what happens is, the dopamine wanting, pay attention to the cues that tell you this is around, releases simultaneously with the neurotransmitters like opioids and endocannabinoids that make you feel kind of pleasure and enjoyment. But what seems to happen with addictive substances is that kind of over time, often you become tolerant to the same dose of that substance. And so the amount of bliss and pleasure and enjoyment you're getting, especially with the same dose, goes down over time. But the dopamine release starts to transition from the actual moment of consumption to being hyper magnified, released at the experience of the cues and the context. And I've seen this clinically so much, both with people I've treated who have substance addictions and people I've treated who eat ultra processed foods addictively, is that they'll say, I don't even enjoy it anymore. I don't even get high, or I don't even taste the food. I'm not enjoying myself. But when I see the Golden Arches, when I see that bar I always used to go to, when I see somebody smoking a cigarette, when I see somebody eating potato chips, I can't think of anything else. I want it so bad that I can't stop myself. And especially if I'm hungry or I'm tired or I'm stressed, you know, I'm so vulnerable to those cues. And so I think that's an important thing to think about, is that it's not so much saying, oh, you shouldn't enjoy your eating. It's about the compulsive wanting, desire, drive. And I think about this for myself too, of like, I was out to lunch with my husband, and I had this delicious bowl. It was like a salad, and it had like nuts and hummus, and it was so good. It was so tasty. And the more I ate it, the more I was like, oh, I'm getting full. Like, I'm not getting as much enjoyment. And that's usually how humans work, right? Like, the less we're enjoying it, the less we're going to do it. So I like pushed the bowl to the side. I was able to tap into my body's hunger and satiety signals and pushed away. And then my husband was like, I'm craving potato chips. He got some potato chips, and they were not very good. They actually didn't taste very good. They were kind of cold, and they were soggy, and they weren't appropriately salted. But I had one, even though I was full. And then I just found myself, even though my bowl of salad was right there, that I just kept kind of shoveling those potato chips into my mouth, even though I was like, this doesn't taste good. I don't like this. Like, why am I feeling this sense of wanting more and more and more of this not very pleasurable, ultra-processed food product relative to this super tasty, enjoyable, nourishing, real food meal? And I think that is where science is going, is that we're starting to acknowledge more and more that like food is not an appropriate label to capture an apple and like a steaming hot apple pie that's mostly goo that you get at McDonald's. Like, those things should not really be considered equitable, both for how they impact your body, your brain, your behavior. So I think as scientists, we're starting to try and dive in more and more to why has it been that it's really been in the last, 50 years, when the food environment changed so kind of dramatically, that we have started to see this massive increase in obesity and diabetes and diet-related disease, and people, the diet industry's become so wealthy, but people clearly want to eat differently, but find that they're unable to do so, even if they know it's going to kill them, even if they know they have, unmanaged type 2 diabetes and might have an amputation or go blind. So there's something really compelling about these that we just don't see. We don't see people eating apples, I just had a whole bushel of apples. Oh, I sat down and ate 4 avocados in one sitting. If you make that like you mush it up and add some ultra processed, tortilla chips maybe, but like on its own, people just aren't doing that. And so we really need to understand that more and equip people with information so they can kind of consider these foods as, is this really food, or is this actually more like a drug that's been engineered to hook me?
Yeah, I love those points about the motivation versus the bliss. I feel like I've had that countless times where I'm triggered to buy something and I get it and I'm thinking, I don't even enjoy this while I'm eating it. And so it's definitely that dopamine that's kind of driving that behavior then. And so that's interesting for people who get truly addictive. They get the cue response, and you mentioned they can get the multiple hits of dopamine. Do we have research, or do you know how long does that kind of dopamine high, shall we say, last? And is it possible that okay, it doesn't last.
It doesn't last very long, but that's actually predictive of addictive drugs. That drugs that don't have a very long hang time, it's more about the spike and a crash. Okay. It's like if you take it and you're kind of in this state and it lasts, it's that you take it, you're sensitive to the cues, but I get like the degree to which you're getting this kind of dopamine nourishment sort of hit. Drugs that have a shorter hang time leave you feeling like you want more. Like you got this burst and now you feel deprived again. Burst, deprived again. Burst, deprived again. And so what we like, that's part of what's going on, is that, you get a dopamine release when you eat watermelon and when you eat an apple, but it's more of this kind of a low and slow. It's like a nicotine patch. And people, nicotine patches aren't very addictive, even though it's delivering nicotine right into your body. But the way a nicotine patch is delivering nicotine is it's slow and it's steady, and you're not getting rapid spike and crash, rapid spike and crash. That's what you get from cigarettes. That's why you smoke a cigarette and you feel momentarily better, but then soon you're feeling kind of having this dopamine crash and you need another hit. That's what there's some suggestion that these kind of foods are doing. And that's part not just by the sugar and fat that's in them, but all the things that have been removed from them. So the water, the fiber, the protein, the food matrix has been altered. So they're essentially like 92 varieties of like paste or syrup that has just been flavored differently, that just melts in your mouth and is easily digested in your gut. And the rewarding nutrients are more bioavailable, so they hit your system more rapidly. And so you're not getting that low, slow, steady profile, which is actually a treatment for addiction that helps people be less vulnerable. So I think a lot about, and we're starting to see this in our lab and some studies that we're doing, is if we make it really convenient and accessible for people to eat real food that tastes good. Like, I think the ultra processed foods set us up to have these expectations that they're going to be so amazing. And then again, like I remember a time I was in grad school and I was running participants and I didn't have time to go get lunch. So I like got these Oreos out of the vending machine and they were stale and they were gross. And I ate the whole package and I was like, why? This isn't
right.
But I expected it to be fantastic. With addictive substances, we get these really positive expectations and they don't match reality. And we see that in our research with food, that especially people who are more vulnerable to this addictive profile have these expectations that they're going to feel blissed out and in so much enjoyment and pleasure, even though when they consume them, it's often not reaching the expectation. Yeah. But what we see is that a lot of folks who have this more addictive profile actually have very, very negative expectations about how they're going to feel if they ate a salad or they had like a salmon grain bowl. There's this like kind of idea of I'm going to feel deprived and I'm going to feel angry and I'm going to feel dissatisfied. So when you combine those two of like, oh, I'm going to be angry if I eat a really, a salad, and then I'm going to feel great if I have the cheeseburger, that doesn't always match up to reality. Some of you feel sluggish and you feel kind of gross after the milkshake and the potato chips, and you actually feel more energized after the salmon grain bowl sort of situation. So I think there's this space that if we can help people see where some of their expectations are mismatched, and the expectation is in many ways shaped by the food industry. I mean, they spend so much money marketing their products and using language about how it's going to make you feel better and less angry. And, if you're in a bad mood, eat a Snickers. Like that's what the alcohol companies do. That's what the tobacco companies did. They give you the expectations for you and prime those for you. And we don't have a big apple or like a big salmon being like, you're actually going to feel better if you just eat the salmon grain bowl and have an apple. So we don't have that kind of narrative. But what we're seeing in our lab is that when we put people on kind of calorically matched, we're not trying to super calorically restrict people, trying to keep them pretty weight stable, but change the quality of what they're eating and put them on a minimally processed balanced diet and have 3 meals, 1 or 2 snacks. I have been flabbergasted at even people who have this addictive tendency, how much better they report feeling. And they just feel their energy is better, their mood is more stable, their sleep is better, they're not as vulnerable to cravings. And I think most people in our society, when they try and, go on a diet, for lack of a better word, it's often like extreme caloric restriction, and they're often having ultra processed junk food that has like a health label on it, that I think they're not actually being nourished. And so I'm really interested in this idea of like, I'm like, our society is not set up to make this easy. And there's some evidence that people can feel like they're going through withdrawal in those first few days when they're trying to cut down. So we're trying to think about, can we do something like we partner with a meal delivery service right now in one of my studies called Fresh and Lean, and we deliver we're working with people who have depression, and we're delivering all their food, all their meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, of all minimally processed kind of Mediterranean style foods for 2 weeks, relative to a control where we just say try and eat healthy, to make it as easy and feasible as possible for people to start to feel these beneficial effects and maybe get through that wave of the first couple of days when you might be feeling kind of more cravings and, kind of really missing your favorite fix. So we're trying to think about how can we help people kind of feel how much better that they might feel if they're eating this way, but then really also thinking and talking with policymakers about then how do we use the levers of policy to make it convenient, cheap, and affordable for people to eat tasty, minimally processed meals. And Cory Booker and Bernie Sanders actually just introduced a bill, I believe it was last week, trying to do these sorts of things to move forward some of these aspects of trying to at least label, make it clear with labeling, restricting of marketing, doing educational campaigns at least to try and pull some of those levers in our food environment. So right now it just prioritizes profits over the well-being of Americans and American children. So Senator Booker and Senator Sanders have really been trying to advocate for change on a wide scale level.
Yeah. The food environment, we might circle back there, but I think before getting to some of that policy and the restriction stuff, we've kind of hinted at, and you've even mentioned some of the parallels with big tobacco, even just with the nicotine, but also the marketing. And that was something I don't think I knew about at all before just kind of getting involved more with your content. Can you shed some light on the parallels between how big tobacco has shaped our modern food environment? Links there?
I mean, this is something that I was doing this research for 10 years before I found this out, and I was stunned. So Dr. Laura Schmidt at UCSF has all of this access to these troves of tobacco documents that they had to release from the big lawsuits against tobacco. Well, lo and behold, in the late 1970s and 80s, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, big tobacco companies decided to start diversifying their portfolios. Right at the time, things were kind of getting hot under the collar for them regarding, the health and addictive consequences of their tobacco products. And they bought up processed food and beverage companies like Kraft, like General Foods, like Hawaiian Punch, and Capri Sun, and they became the largest producer and manufacturer for decades of processed foods and beverages. And Dr. Schmidt has published research from those documents to show that they took, formulation, including adding flavor enhancers that they had honed with tobacco and put them in things like children's sugar-sweetened beverages, that they took their marketing know-how of targeting children and targeting racial ethnic communities and doing that very aggressively in the context of processed foods and beverages. And then my other colleague, Dr. Tara Fazzino, did some work really comparing the same product, like a cracker owned by a big tobacco food company and a cracker owned by a non-tobacco owned company, and found that the tobacco owned products were formulated to be more hyper-palatable and have heightened combinations of palatability-inducing ingredients. And so they were kind of ahead of the game. Now, if you looked near the end, after big tobacco had really reshaped the food environment, the non-tobacco-owned companies were paying attention, and they have now also adopted that sort of hyper-palatable combinations. So, and then, kind of big tobacco is still involved in our food environment. They've divested and kind of spun some of those off as there was more public health focus on the obesity epidemic and the type 2 diabetes epidemic. So it's history repeating itself. But the playbook of how to confuse the science and, muddle the public health approaches and how you kind of design and market products, that footprint is already showing up in our food environment. And I always think, as somebody who does work as well in the realm of eating disorders, is when I look at kind of the history of anorexia, a very restrictive, low weight approaches of eating disorders, that was really kind of our first main eating disorder that was seen medically, and in the medical record was kind of that first diagnosis was really this very low weight restrictive subtype. we didn't really start to talk about this binging, loss of control sort of subtype of disordered eating. That didn't start showing up as much in the literature until the 1970s and 80s. That's when bulimia nervosa, binge type, and at first we only focused on kind of people who were also restricting, who were then binging, and maybe they were vomiting and binging. But then in the 2000s, we started kind of realizing that actually the most prevalent eating disorder is people who aren't, doing these huge, vomiting or taking laxatives, but people who are just experiencing binge eating, they're not calorically deprived. And so I'm like, what? Well, why is it that was something that wasn't existing in the medical history until the exact time period that big tobacco got involved in reshaping our food supply? And so to me, it sounds a lot like what we see with addiction epidemics when something like a new opioid or industrialized tobacco products get introduced to the market and they're cheap and we don't understand how risky they are and they're heavily marketed and people are targeted and all of a sudden you see this huge rise in use and addiction. There's this big question for me of like, is that what is happening with the rise in binge type eating disorders at the time this was introduced? And I think we're seeing that also when we look globally. Lots of countries have really wild thin body ideals. What Brazil's like one of the plastic, surgery capitals of the world, but they've only started to see like this like big increase and eating disorders more broadly recently. And I think it's because the Americanized food environment is now being exported. So that combination of really toxic thin body ideals that are unattainable, airbrushed, marketing strategies in and of themselves, combined with foods that are designed and engineered to maximize bliss points and craveability, like that is such a toxic combination that I think people are just really struggling, understandably, to figure out how do I maintain moderation in an environment that is promoting extremes on either side.
Yeah, you kind of got in there with some of the eating disorders. And as far as I understand, binge eating disorder is already diagnosed in the DSM.
That is.
And so can you delineate why food addiction would be different than binge eating without bulimia? Of course, I understand bulimia, but just that kind of coping mechanism of binging. Why is food addiction necessarily a subtype?
Yeah, so we definitely see that it's very different based just purely on prevalence alone. So let me break this down a little bit. It's a little tricky. So the first is, most people who have binge eating disorder also meet for the addiction phenotype. And people who, it's around like 60% or so. People who have binge eating disorder who also endorse the signs of addiction, and I'll say what those are here in a moment, have more frequent binge eating episodes, have more severe psychopathology, have more intense cravings. Binge eating disorder is defined as having frequent, at least once a week, binge eating episodes over a 3-month period. Binging is defined as experiencing a discrete, eating an objectively large amount of food in a discrete period of time while feeling out of control. And then there's other behaviors. Think about addiction is not, it can happen in a binge, right? You can imagine somebody, and we see lots of people will sit down for 2 hours and binge on alcohol. We also see people that have all night binge drink episodes, and we're not like, well, but it was all night and it wasn't 2 hours, so it doesn't count. Also, if you think of somebody chain smoking all day or chain drinking all day, wake up, crack open a beer, drink a beer, don't ever feel like you're out of control, not a discrete period of time, don't feel subjectively out of control. There's so many ways behaviorally that addiction can manifest. I also think it's so just on the surface of how we operationalize these constructs, there's important differences. But also the mechanisms and the drivers that we think are involved are different. So what's traditionally been described, although it's changing a bit, is that binge eating disorder was just a reaction to restricting. That like dieting led you to binge eat. It's not about the food. All good food. It's not, it's not food relevant. It's just that you are restricting and it's leading you to binge. What that ignores is that the vast, vast, vast majority of what people are binging on is ultra processed, highly rewarding foods. And animal models of even animals that are not calorically restricted, if you start to give them icing and cheesecake and potato chips, they will binge. And many people who have something like binge eating disorder actually aren't calorically restricted. So they've started to move in the binge eating world to more of the mechanisms that we've traditionally conceptualized in addiction of it's about dealing with negative affect. It's about responding to cues. It's about struggling with self-control and feeling impulsive at a moment. It's about having an intense craving and doing it. But so now I feel like the mechanisms of addiction are becoming more incorporated into discussions of binge eating. There's also some evidence that if you have people who have binge eating and you put them on a behavioral weight loss treatment program, where you even calorically restrict them and you say, we want you to eat more fruits and veggies and lean meats and whole grains, their binge eating goes down rather than up. So if it was purely restriction, we should see that people with binge eating who are put on behavioral weight loss, caloric restriction diet should be binging way more. And that in experiments are not the case. So I think the restriction model is true for some people, but I think that it is the strength of the science that restriction is kind of the main cause of binge eating is kind of overstated and not individualized. In contrast, when I look at what's unique about the addiction perspective is we say, yeah, the substance that you're consuming or the behavior in the context of gambling has been designed and engineered in a way that delivers reward in a unnaturally intense way that for some people it can drive forward the craving and the loss of control and the desire to use it when you're stressed or you're bored or you're unhappy. And the substance itself interacts with your individual risk factors, but nobody's binge drinking water, just like nobody is binge eating kale, right? So the addiction perspective kind of really brings into the model that the type of substance you're binging is important and causal in this. And again, if we look at, research where you take the same person, you randomly assign them to an ultra processed food diet, or they're in a minimally processed food diet, people eat 400, 500 more calories a day, in the ultra processed food environment. If you look at animal models and you randomly assign that, they'll binge eat these ultra processed foods. If you look at dietary records of people binge eating, it's like 100% ultra processed foods that they're binging on. If somebody who has really extreme thin weight ideals, who desperately wants to be thin, could get the same fix by binge eating salad and not gaining weight, oh, they would. And it's so like that is why it's not just the act of eating, it's about what you're consuming. And so I think the current eating disorder perspectives that say kind of it's not about the food at all, it's solely about how you relate to the food, is not equipping people with the knowledge of what we're seeing through neuroscience and our understanding of reward and craving and desire. And so it's like, well, why can I eat a whole bowl of strawberries and be okay, but I have like a bowl of ice cream that was the same amount of calories, and all night long I'm just going back to the freezer to have like a little bit more? Like, why? What's wrong with me? It's like, well, that strawberry cheesecake ice cream was probably designed by $1 billion company that used to be owned by Big Tobacco that puts tons of research and development into making that irresistible, and Mother Nature does not, so yeah, I think we're not equipping people to fully understand the risk necessarily that they're engaging with.
Yeah. I think a lot of my clients think they're like the only ones with this weakness. And I'm like, I think everybody else. But one of the things, though, you kind of had gotten earlier, you were talking a little bit about policy and how we can kind of control. But as far as I understand, something like getting food addiction in the DSM could actually be one of the levers for policy change, right? And could you kind of explain that?
And I'm sorry, I'm really glad you reminded me of that, because the other part of the puzzle that I didn't talk about because I got waylaid, as I want to do, is that while most people with binge eating disorder also meet for the addiction criteria. So my lab has, what I'm kind of known for in my research program, which is like very simple, actually, it's not rocket science, is we said, so it seems like these certain sorts of foods might trigger an addiction. People will say, I feel addicted to these. Well, how should we actually define that? How would we know when somebody might be actually experiencing kind of an addiction? We're like, well, we use the exact same criteria in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Disorders, to diagnose with somebody with whether they have a smoking addiction, something that's not intoxicating, that's legal, to a heroin addiction, right? We use these same criteria. We've been using them for decades. And it also helps us separate out, is there somebody who's just a social drinker, versus somebody who's actually losing control? And so we just applied those criteria, which are things like you lose control over your intake, you can't cut down despite wanting to, you experience intense cravings. When you cut down, you maybe feel irritable or anxious or physical symptoms. You need more and more of the substance to kind of hit the same reward. These sorts of, you're continuing to use it even though you're having negative consequences like a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. And that's all the diagnostic criteria for addiction that we apply, whether it's tobacco or whether it's heroin. So we just applied those in the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which is where I was for grad school. And we just applied that to the intake of these highly rewarding foods. Mm-hmm. So based on that, the existing substance use disorder criteria, what we commonly call substance addiction, 14% of adults and 12% of children would qualify for this addiction if the substance was these foods. That is very similar to alcohol. Alcohol, third leading cause of preventable death after smoking and diet-related disease, is third. And 90% of people drink alcohol. It's legal, it's easily accessible. About 14% develop an alcohol use disorder. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing that, again, it's not like everybody who has an Oreo cookie or everybody who ever has a glass of wine becomes addicted, but there's this substantial aspect of our society that really is experiencing clinically significant impairment or distress in these addictive sort of intake patterns with these legal, easily accessible substances. 12% of children, we don't see substance addictions in children at that rate ever because we protect them. I guess we used to with tobacco when we let teenagers be aggressively targeted. But in our modern world, we protect children against marketing and access and exposure to addictive substances. Mm-hmm. If we really took a step back and looked at these ultra-processed foods, they're so novel, they're so familiar to us. They're, the cartoons we grew up with, they're the places we had our birthday parties. And if we actually looked at the level of disease and health consequences, and now growing evidence of mental health consequences of depression and anxiety associated with high levels of intake on it, it's truly comparable to alcohol and tobacco. And but we're numb to it, right? It's kind of been this gradual drip, drip, drip of it. And if we said this, I'm not going to stand for 12% of American children before they can even vote are essentially addicted to a substance that can kill them and take years off their life and make them miserable. We wouldn't stand for it. But with food, with these ultra processed foods, we're kind of numb right now. And so I think we're moving towards waking that up because it's just intolerable.
Mm-hmm. And what would just be the step to get it in? Is it that American Psychiatric Board has to approve it?
Yeah, the American Psychiatric Association will review it. So right now I've actually been working for the past multiple years on writing up this report that's required for the APA to consider it. It has both been good and a bad thing that we have over 400 unique empirical studies based on the Yale Food Addiction Scale from all over the world, and from samples that go up to over 100,000 people that have been done. And so we need to summarize that data based on the validators that the APA wants, which we're doing, which I've actually finished with my colleagues, Erica Schulte, now Erica Lafata, and Alyssa Morano, an entire 56-page single-spaced document with and not including the tables or the references on that topic that I'm hoping to submit to the APA. We're just getting ready to circulate that amongst some scientists and get their feedback and things like that. But I'm hoping by August at the absolute latest. I'm really hoping by August. We will have submitted that to the APA. Now, I don't know what will happen. The APA will consider the evidence. If I look at the evidence base that was existing for things like internet gaming disorder or prolonged grief disorder that have been recently, admitted at least as a full diagnosis or a condition that is to be considered but maybe needs some more study, which I think this is what we're suggesting is a good first step for considering, this ultra processed food addiction, is let's put it in as it's called the appendix. Like that's where internet gaming disorder is right now. It's like, there's pretty strong evidence we should do some more long-term clinical trials, and, we need to do these like field trials. But the evidence base for at least reaching that bar, based on my read of it, based on decisions for other conditions, it really surpasses that. Now, whether that'll actually end up in that decision, we'll see. But I feel like the strength of the science is striking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, congratulations on the progress there.
That has been a beast. Yes, the co-authors have been really essential to moving that along.
Well, I just want to close out with maybe a kind of a practical question. You kind of mentioned that, there are plenty of people who drink alcohol and they're not addicted. You can be a social drinker. You can even be a social eater of processed foods.
Yeah.
So how does someone really start to understand if they're just using processed foods in a non-problematic coping mechanism? Maybe one day you just ate the pint of ice cream, but it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Versus, wow, I really have a problem. Like what should they do kind of as their next step?
So our Yale food addiction scale is freely available. I suggest for people kind of scoring it themselves that the modified Yale food addiction scale 2.0 it's a 13-item scale. It's easier to score. Scoring this thing is a huge pain because we have to mimic the DSM's decision making, which is complicated. But in general, what I generally find is that if people are finding that, what I see as the core of it typically is that people report, I want to cut down and I can't. I've tried and I can't stick to it, even though I know it's impacting me on a physical, mental, social level. Like this is really impact. If I waved a magic wand and this suddenly disappeared, my quality of life would be significantly better. And I know this, and I am still just compelled by my cravings, by my desire to keep consuming this. That to me suggests that there's maybe this addictive mechanism at play for just kind of a lay understanding of it. Again, if it's like you had a bad day and you went out with friends and you had, 2 martinis or 3 martinis and you took an Uber home, you're saying like, you're not, you're an addict. And same thing if you're like overate some cookies. It's this more of this, it really starts to be, when I talk to people, it's like, it's here. Like it is like it's central in your life. It is almost starts to feel like it is just the weight, the brick that is like pulling you down. And that could be because of health consequences. Like you have type 2 diabetes and you're taking years off your life, or you're so distressed and preoccupied. I mean, I hear that a lot, like the food noise of just, you're in a meeting with your boss, but you're just thinking about when do you get to leave and what you're going to have for your snack. And it's so intense. But we see with addiction generally, it's not this huge qualitative distinction. It's not like, here's everybody who looks addicted and here's everybody else. And this is what it means to be addicted. And this is what it looks like when you're not an addict. Like you don't care at all. And you never overindulge and you never use it to cope and you never have cravings. Like it's really much more of a spectrum for all addictive substances. And so I think that's also really important to consider is like, you might not have this full-blown addiction where you're clinically impaired or distressed. It's really negatively impacting your quality of life. But it may be that like, most days of the week, you end up having 2 Coca-Cola and a donut. And, if that is happening 5 days a week, you are increasing your risk for diet disease, for excessive rapid weight gain, potentially for mental health issues. And part of the reason why I think it's like, you have the one donut and then you just want more donut is because they're designed to make, to really instill that greater desire in you. And so I think we see that the average American is reporting 1 to 2 symptoms of addiction, of intense cravings, of, eating more than they want to, even though they know it's impacting them negatively, even if they're not fully impaired and distressed. And so when that's on such a wide scale, because like over 60% of our food supply is now these really rewarding ultra processed foods on a wide scale public health way, this is setting us up to be a less healthy society, both mentally and physically. And so I think the application of understanding why it might be important for understanding if these ultra processed foods are actually addictive not just bad for you. They're like bad for you and addictive, not just like bad for you, but like, oh yeah, the more you eat it, the more you're gonna, is important, even if you don't feel like your entire life is revolving around, these foods.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're definitely going to link to that Yale Food Addiction Scale notes so people will check that out. And thank you so much for your time. I know my listeners are really going to appreciate your insight into all of this.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was nice to chat with you.
Thank you so much to Ashley for her time and for that great conversation. Thank you to you for tuning into the show. One more time, if you haven't yet, please do consider sharing the show on social media, in person. Walk up to strangers in the grocery store and show them your phone and say, you should listen to this. That would be very helpful, and I'd be very impressed if anybody actually did that. Thank you in advance. Thank you, of course, as always, EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.